Josh Fenton, CEO and co-founder. We're not waiting a minute. We missed her last week. She was too busy for us. She is back, the chair of the Political Science Department at the University of Virginia, Jennifer Lawless. Professor, thank you so much for joining us.
I would always rather be with you. Just keep that in mind.
Well, we are glad you are back because there is so much national news going on. It is almost limitless, the number of topics. Let's jump right into it. The Biden White House, which had some inklings of good news, some jobs numbers were good. Got the inflation numbers today, 7.5%. The highest inflation, I joked with you earlier that in 500 years. That might be a slight exaggeration, but this is not great news for the Biden administration and their argument of a great economic recovery.
It's not. It's not a surprise to people either, though, who have felt it in their pockets for the last several months. I mean, I think in terms of timing, if this is the peak, it's better that it happens now than in June or July. If it's not the peak, then the administration has problems. So I think they have to just keep doing what they're doing. They have to keep encouraging bills like the components of Build Back Better to get passed to at least allay some of the costs that people are enduring for, services. But this is just something that's going to have to be waited out, and the Fed is going to get involved. But there's no easy fix here, and the numbers are obviously not the numbers that any administration would want to see.
Let's talk a little bit about Build Back Better. I believe our U.S. Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo, continues to tweet about Build Back Better like it's a freestanding $6.5 trillion piece of legislation. I don't believe it's any longer a 6.5 standalone piece of legislation. That didn't work out so well. Is there a strategy, and why is it taking another month since de facto Senator Manchin killed Build Back Better for these components to start rolling out and passing, at least in the House?
I think that some of it has to do with the fact that by breaking it into its component parts, you're going to need 60 votes in the Senate. So because it would not be a bill that's just going through reconciliation. So I think there are two different tracks going on. The first is there a way, even though Joe Manchin has said Build Back Better is dead, to maybe have Build Back a little and have a much, much smaller version, but that could still go through the reconciliation process. So the 50 senators in the House, the 50 senators plus Kamala Harris would be enough to pass it. The parallel track would be trying to figure out which Republicans in the Senate would be willing to get on board with these various components. I don't think that Nancy Pelosi or the House are going to try to put through these sub pieces if they're doomed to fail. So my sense is that the delay is because the Senate has to figure out the best approach. And if you believe these reports, Chuck Schumer and Joe Manchin are not best friends right now, so that could also be accounting for some of the delay.
Is there any thought about just renaming it? Rebuild, Forward, Pretty Good, something like that, that might slip by Joe Manchin and gain some support? I mean, the name itself, Build Back Better, seems to be a little bit of a stained brand amongst moderates and obviously with conservatives, but there are components in which numerous non-Democrats, non-liberal, progressive Democrats have voiced elements of support for. I am perplexed that none of these things seem to be moving forward.
I'm a little bit surprised that the carving of the pieces hasn't happened yet. But again, I think that Chuck Schumer knows how to count. And if he can't get to 60, he can't get to 60. And it's now an election year. So the incentives for Republicans to cooperate with the Democrats on something that could ultimately be branded a Democratic success become a little bit more limited. I do think that on some of these components, we are going to see movement. It's just taking a long time. We know that community college is not going to be part of that. We know that major healthcare expansion is likely not going to be part of it either.
Let's jump over to Mitch McConnell's utterance, his comments on January 6th, and specifically criticizing the RNC for sanctioning two members of the January 6th Special Commission, the two Republican members. It was somewhat unexpected, and it was stronger than I would have anticipated how hard he criticized the RNC for their approach.
But it's meaningless. And when push has come to shove, he's done nothing to show support for Republicans like Liz Cheney or Adam Kinzinger. He's done nothing to suggest that the Republican leadership should be holding Donald Trump accountable. He's been nothing except somebody who has tried to stymie this committee. You might recall that he didn't think that the January 6th committee should exist in the first place. So although he does believe when the bar is so low that maybe the RNC shouldn't have said that Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger are basically not Republicans, he hasn't done anything to support the kind of investigation or the kind of, patriotism, frankly, that would come with actually debunking Trump and what happened on January 6th.
Let's jump over to the star reporter, or one of the star reporters at the New York Times, Maggie Hammerman, has a new book out on Donald Trump. And the lead this morning on CNN of why this book is so important, with Maggie Hammerman on the panel, was that Donald Trump tried to take documents and flush them down the White House toilet. In the grand scheme of things that are being alleged about the former president, that doesn't seem to be the biggest crime that he committed. But is there also some fairness in criticizing these journalists who are on the front line, who are withholding information from the public in cases for months or years because they have a book in the works?
I think so. I think it's important not to cast a really wide net here, because sometimes it's just juicy gossip that doesn't really threaten national security or violate any rule or norm. And there, I totally get holding on to it because you want that juicy panel, you want that juicy headline. In other cases, when it could actually help an investigation, I do think that there's an ethical responsibility on the part of journalists to share what they have, not necessarily on CNN, but I don't know, with Congress or the Justice Department. And it's not just that he might have flushed these documents down the toilet. She's not the most reliable source, but Omarosa said the other day that he used to also eat documents. And today I read this morning early that the committee has found that there are also holes in the phone records. There seem to have been deleted phone records on the day of the riot on January 6th, when people know Donald Trump was actually making phone calls. So all of these pieces put together, I think, justifies the National Archives' request that there be an investigation into how Donald Trump handled presidential material. And it would be somewhat ironic if this is ultimately what gets him, because he was so public and so clear about everything that he was doing that was illegal and unethical all along, that if trying to hide these documents or eat them or flush them is what brings him down, it's sort of amusing because everybody knew he was doing this.
Let's jump over to the 2nd congressional race here in Rhode Island, in the 2nd congressional district. Seth Magaziner is in the race. Alan Fung on the Republican side is soon to be in the race, according to sort of everyone involved. Also have a range of folks who've jumped in, I think since we last spoke. Joy Fox, who's a longtime staffer, both to Langevin and Gina Raimondo, entered the race. You know her. You ran against Jim Langevin in the early 2000s for that seat. Talk about that experience about running against Jim Langevin and what the key issues were. What was the issue that differentiated you from Jim Langevin?
I mean, so we were very clear in saying that it was not a single issue campaign, and it wasn't. I cared about the war in Iraq. I cared about the right to privacy in general, but a woman's right to choose was the biggest difference. And in 2006, when I was running, Jim Langevin had already voted 27 times against a woman's right to choose in the 6 years that he'd been in Congress. And my argument then, and this is my argument now, is what's the point in electing Democrats who are going to stymie reproductive rights? That's just helping Republicans. You may as well hand the Republicans a seat. And now, when choice is especially under attack, it's more important than ever. Now, over time, Jim Langevin's position did evolve. And, in the last couple of Congresses, he certainly hasn't done anything to, suggest that he's not willing to further women's reproductive freedom. But I will say that when Joy Fox worked with him, she was one of the people who enabled his anti-choice agenda. And I would say that when you look at the 2nd congressional district, even if it's a little bit less blue than the 1st congressional district, Rhode Island overall is 2/3 pro-choice. And I would be worried if I lived in that district about sending somebody to Washington who does not have credentials to suggest that she actually supports a woman's right to choose.
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic in this race. Her entry being, you know, a staffer, but a fairly prominent staffer, known in political circles, not in the general public, but certainly known in political circles, and being a potentially competitive woman candidate. Obviously, the Democratic congressional delegation in Rhode Island is all men. Obviously, the congressional delegation is all Democrats right now. Her defense of Langevin for years and taking that position, does that discount her ability to really be a powerful voice for women, and especially as Roe v. Wade is now headed for another review by the U.S. Supreme Court in one machination or another? Is that going to be a factor?
I think it is. I also think that she's not running in a vacuum. So she's running against candidates. Seth Magaziner is clearly one who has time and time again demonstrated that he actually is a strong voice for reproductive rights. And he's represented the state, which means he's represented people in that district. She hasn't. So, you know, I think that there are different things that matter to different voters. I think choice is going to be far more important this election cycle than ever before, because if the Supreme Court overturns Roe versus Wade, one way to protect women's reproductive rights nationally is to pass federal legislation. So it's not just the Senate that's important in terms of confirming Supreme Court justices, it's also the House, assuming that Roe v. Wade gets overturned, to put forward this legislation. Now, there's nothing to suggest that she's not pro-choice now, but again, maybe she was even pro-choice then, but not pro-choice enough to, you know, sort of, she was willing to work for somebody who was willing to stymie that agenda.
Yeah, speaking of the Supreme Court, let's jump over there. Where are we with the Supreme Court process in the White House? Will we hear a name in the next week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month?
Well, so you know what complicated the expeditious naming of a Supreme Court justice is, unfortunately, a Democratic senator from New Mexico had a stroke. He's fine. He's going to be back up and running in a few weeks, but they certainly can't move forward without every Democratic vote. And that suggests that Joe Biden doesn't have an incentive to move forward with a name until he knows for sure that all of the Democrats are back in Washington. I would predict by the end of this month. That's what he originally said, that he would put forward a name by the end of this month. And we know that there's a lot of vetting going on right now. But, you know, I don't think that there's going to be a name in the next week or 10 days.
There's a very close, a powerful member of the House of Representatives. Probably Joe Biden wouldn't be president if it wasn't for this individual from South Carolina. He has a strong candidate who's in the top 3 to 5 names being bantered around. Is that a factor? Does Joe Biden owe to Representative Clyburn in his ear to his suggestion as to who should be on the Supreme Court?
Well, you know, Clyburn obviously helped. He endorsed Joe Biden, and that's largely why Joe Biden won South Carolina and then propelled that into a series of Super Tuesday victories. It was important to Jim Clyburn that you know, there be a person of color on the ticket with Joe Biden, and there was. It's been important to Jim Clyburn that Joe Biden prioritize voting rights and other issues that really matter to the Black community, and he has. And he's also put forward Michelle Childs as a potential justice. Interestingly, Lindsey Graham seems to support her as well. The issue for Biden is that he also owes the progressives quite a bit, and Child's record on workers' rights is not what they would like. And so I would not be surprised if she's ultimately not the nominee.
And where do you think, you talk to a lot of folks, where do you think they're leaning? I mean, I know they haven't vetted anyone hard yet. They haven't been in the White House. They haven't had those calls yet, per se, those interview calls. But do you get a sense of where it's going? Is it going to California? Is it going to the D.C. circuit? Where do you think it is?
I mean, probably the D.C. circuit for a couple of reasons. The first is when you look at, you know, recent confirmation hearings, recent Supreme Court justices have come from there. Second, you know, there have been recent confirmations to the federal judiciary out of that circuit. So into that circuit. So I just think that it's more likely. I also think, quite frankly, that I wouldn't be surprised if there's a name that we're not actually hearing that much of that makes its way all the way to the top. I don't know who that person would be, but I do think that the Biden administration has sort of shown a propensity to mix things up a little. At the end of the day, for example, it was Kamala Harris, but remember that leading up to that, Val Demings, Karen Bass, people that no one had really heard of became household names in those last few weeks.
Heck, Gina Raimondo supposedly got interviewed for the job.
Right.
So you never know.
Right.
Speaking of intrigue, Ukraine, the president seems to have done a pretty good job marshaling sort of the old NATO gang back together again to put a lot of pressure on Russia and on Putin to at least take a hard think about this before invading the Ukraine, that there's not only going to be freezing his assets and freezing oligarchs' assets in the United States, but maybe that pipeline won't work anymore. Where do you think, how well has he achieved his goals on this thing, and how well has he managed this crisis to date?
So I give him an A on this, and I think it's important for a couple of reasons. The first is exactly what you said, that he sort of cobbled back the NATO allies and suggested that the United States can be a leader. And frankly, that the United States is willing, even before NATO is willing to commit troops, to do what it needs to do to reassure border nations that we're going to protect them if they're our allies. And that's important. That's not something that the rest of the world believed or saw with the Trump administration. So I think in and of itself, that's important. The other thing that's really important here is that it's a foreign policy success, at least so far, that I think begins to push us further and further away from Afghanistan and what was certainly a bungled exit. Now, it's unclear, and I said this then, that the exit could have been much better, but the communication around it and the expectations regarding it certainly could have been. This one seems to have been planned and executed with an eye toward being able to inform Americans what's going on, being able to inform the global community what's going on, and being able to inform citizens in the Ukraine about the timeline by which they should start to exit.
Yeah, and he's encouraged Americans there, has not ordered them to leave the country, but has encouraged them to begin their exodus, which I think is an important point. Let's talk about what we should be looking forward to. What's going to happen over the next week to 10 days and nationally, other than no one watching the Olympics, but other than that, what else should we be looking towards?
I think the January 6th committee is where most of the action is going to be over the course of the next week or so. We're already seeing more and more coming out from the committee in terms of what they're hearing from witnesses. Last week it was a lot about Mark Short and what he was able to convey about Mike Pence and the experience that they had during January 6th while they were hiding in the Capitol. This week, we're already beginning to hear about lapses in records and what it is that the committee is looking for and what kinds of holes they're trying to fill. The National Archives requesting an investigation feeds right into that. So my bet is that over the course of the next week, it's going to be these drips and drabs that might add up to a more damning picture. Now, whether that picture is ever going to be sufficiently damning for Republicans to say, all right, you know what, enough is enough, here's a smoking gun, is unclear. I mean, they were chanting hang Mike Pence, and that wasn't a smoking gun for these Republicans, but it might be enough for Merrick Garland.
And then let me ask you, what's the timeline on this thing? They've got to be careful. If this January 6th leaks into the middle of the summer, I think it's going to be perceived to be very political. It's going to be, oh, this is electioneering. They held this thing as long as they could to try and impact congressional races. Don't they really need to have some kind of document, some kind of findings, some kind of recommendations out sometime this spring?
Yes, and my recollection is that the original plan was April-ish. So, and that's when they would also have some televised, if not hearings, then at least discussions. So my bet is that within the next, 6 to 8 weeks, we'll start at least having a better sense of that timeline. But, keep in mind, too, that it's unclear what happens once they issue their document. And it's unclear not only about what it's going to say, although I think we have a general sense of, who was to blame and who knew what when, but also what the Justice Department is going to do with that and how high they're going to go in terms of suggesting culpability.
We will keep an eye on it. As always, the chair of the Political Science Department at the University of Virginia, we always appreciate you taking the time and joining us each week. For everybody else, stay tuned. It is 50 degrees outside. It's supposed to be even warmer tomorrow. A time to celebrate. It's like a little mini spring for all of us. as we head into Super Bowl and Valentine's Day weekend. Oh, can we only imagine if those 2 days overlapped and fell on the same day? It would have been quite a dynamic day in many households across America. Everybody stay safe. If you haven't gotten boosted, get boosted. It really makes a difference. If you got your second shot more than 6 months ago, you need to get boosted. Thanks, everybody.